I met him the morning the city smelled like rain and cinnamon, the kind of morning that makes even the mountains lean in closer. I'd gone out early to outrun my own thoughts along the Sea Point promenade, ponytails slapping the back of my neck, earbuds fighting a losing battle with gulls and waves. A hand-painted sign caught my eye on the walk back to my car. Sunrise loaves, warm bread, warmer hearts. It was tucked on a corner of Bocap where the houses wore sherbet colors and the cobbles still remembered horses. I stepped inside because of the smell, but I stayed because of the smile. He was behind the counter, forearms dusted with flour, the sleeves of a plain gray t-shirt pushed to his elbows, and a streak of dough like a comet across his jaw. "First time?" he asked. "It won't be your last." He slid a paper bag to me before I could choose. Masbalages. Sweet, soft, best eaten on the pavement while it's still trying to breathe. I laughed and broke the bread with my fingers. Steam kissed my face. Anise and butter made a home behind my ribs. "I'm Layla," I said, licking sugar from my thumb. "Saifo," he replied, tapping the register with a floury knuckle. "If you like that, wait till you meet the croissants. They're shy, must be coaxed out at dawn." I paid more than the price and left before he saw my car, the one that had been a graduation gift and a quiet trap, a sleek reminder of what I belonged to. I went back the next morning and the next. Each visit a pebble in a path I pretended I wasn't laying. He told me Dawn's secrets in the language of butter and ovens. "Pastries like people," he said once, folding dough into thirds with careful hands. "If you rush it, it resists. If you ignore it, it dies. But if you give it time and warmth, it rises without you forcing it." I told him nothing that mattered, just jokes about joggers and seagulls and the way the mountain wears its tablecloth when it's shy. I never said Bishop's Court, never said the family foundation that funded winter blankets and summer galas, never said my father's name, which could open doors and shut mouths in the same motion. With Saifo, I was just a girl buying bread with hair that wouldn't behave and a laugh I'd forgotten how to use. He started keeping a paper cup with my name on it. I learned he'd saved for years for the second-hand mixer that took up half his kitchen. I learned his mother had taught him to braid dough before she lost her strength to an illness with a long name and short mercy. On a Tuesday, he slid a plate across the counter, 2 warm Coke Sisters shining with syrup, a single strawberry like a punctuation mark. "For the girl who eats on the pavement," he said. On a Thursday, after I stayed too late, he walked me to my car and saw it and something shuddered in his eyes. He handed me my bag and said goodnight with careful distance. I went home tasting sugar and uncertainty. The first time we kissed, Cape Town was holding its breath between seasons. He had closed early because the oven had sulked and refused to come to temperature, and we sat on milk crates in the back, ankles crossed, passing a jar of apricot jam like contraband. "When I was little," he said, "I thought rich people's houses were quiet because they had nothing to worry about. Then I started delivering bread to Bishop's Court kitchens and realized sometimes quiet is just everyone holding their breath." I swallowed and pictured my mother counting wine glasses the way other women count prayers. "And poor houses?" I asked. He grinned. "Never quiet. Someone's always laughing or arguing or singing or all three." Outside, clouds were smeared like soft chalk. He reached to tuck a curl behind my ear and left a smear of flour on my cheek. I caught his wrist and pressed it there, wanting to keep the mark. "Layla," he said. Like the word was a question he already knew the answer to. The kiss was warm and a little clumsy, the way first kisses should be, with apricot and sugar and the promise of something that might hold in the oven of a life if we were brave enough to set the timer and wait. We built our own mornings. He taught me to laminate dough, to listen for the whisper that told you when butter and flour had agreed to dance. I taught him how to photograph a croissant, so even people on diets would sigh and share. On Sundays, when he closed for deliveries to old aunties who still wore slippers at noon, I rode shotgun with boxes in my lap as he navigated streets that my friends never drove unless there was a restaurant to post about. He knew everyone's name and half their secrets. They knew his birthday, his broken oven, his mother's favorite hymn. We were 2 circles that overlapped in the small hours, when the city's rich and poor both slept, and only us and the bakers and the guards kept watch. We kept our love like we kept dough, folding it over and over in layers, trusting the rise. If life had been a story we wrote for ourselves, it would have stayed like that. Flower mornings, kiss afternoons, long walks under streetlights that hummed with moths. But my father believed in outcomes, not stories. When he found out, because men of his kind always find out, his anger didn't roar. It arrived dressed in concern. "You have a good heart, Layla," he said, the way he spoke to donors just before they signed a check. "But you are not responsible for saving men who cannot save themselves." I stood very still on the wrong side of his desk, the skyline pretending to listen through the glass. "I don't need to save anyone," I said. "I love him." He steepled his fingers. "Love is a fine thing for poems and charities. For life, you need strategy." That week, our foundation announced a partnership with a developer for affordable retail spaces in emerging nodes. The photograph showed smiling traders in borrowed aprons. The map showed Woodstock. The unit numbers showed rent without mercy. Sunrise Loaf sat one block outside of Mercy. Saifo read the letter on a Wednesday. He held it like it might bite. "Dear tenant," it said, though he had never missed a payment, "your lease will not be renewed due to precinct redevelopment. You may apply for a new space at market-related rates." Market-related meant 3 times what he could pay. "It's my father," I said, because the thing about truth is it burns on the way out. "I'm so sorry." He didn't look at me. He looked at the oven, then the mixer, then the calendar where he'd circled 2 birthdays and a women's shelter bake sale. "I'm not a fool," he said softly. "I knew your life was different. I just didn't know your life could end mine." I reached for him, but he stepped back, hands on hips, chin lifted the way men lift it when they're planning how not to break in front of the person who might be the reason. "I'll fix it," I said. "I'll talk to him." He shook his head. "Don't." The word was gentle and hopeless. "I will not be your project, Layla." I tried anyway. The thing about money is it can move like water if it chooses to, filling gaps and dousing fires. The thing about pride is it can hold a line like a dam. I took my trust card and called landlords and whispered offers and begged the city planner who danced with me once at a gala. I sat in the foyer of my father's office with a mug of coffee I didn't drink. He let me in after 35 minutes because that is the exact length of patience men like him have for daughters who will not accept the plan. "You're young," he said. "You think love is enough." I told him love was the only economy that didn't collapse. He told me he admired my passion and would ensure the developer consider community stakeholders. I left his office with a promise that felt like a refund for something I hadn't bought. The bakery filled with neighbors and silence. People came to buy more than they needed as if they could build a barricade out of bread. He smiled and packed boxes and said thank you until the word went hoarse. At night, we closed the shutters and tried to pretend we had a plan. He kissed me with the kind of hunger I understood and a kind of distance I didn't. "I can help with the new rent until we grow," I said, hating the tremor I heard in my own voice. He rubbed his thumb over my knuckles. "You can't be the oven and the dough," he said. "If I can't keep my own heat, I don't deserve to rise." We argued quietly because sadness has its own etiquette. I said he was stubborn. He said I was naive. I said I didn't care about money. He said money cared about me whether I asked it to or not. He slept on the bakery couch that week, and I went home and stared at ceilings that had never felt lower. The night of the fire, the wind came down from the mountain and took what it wanted. A faulty wire in an old wall. The kind of flaw that hides behind fresh paint until heat lets it speak, turned a corner of the kitchen mean. By the time a neighbor banged on the shutter and Saifo found the extinguisher, flames had climbed into the rafters like boys on a dare. He put it out before the whole place went, but the oven coughed and sighed and died. I found him in the street with water in his hair and black on his hands, looking at the building like you look at someone who's not answering your calls. He wasn't hurt, not where blood shows, but something in him had fled. "Maybe it's a sign," he said, and he didn't mean it the way aunties mean it when they're trying to make you feel better. I wanted to hold his face and shout no at the sky. Instead, I touched his sleeve and said, "We can clean it." He nodded and didn't move. We didn't make it through the following week. He closed the shop with a note that said, "See you soon," and I hated it because it felt like a lie told in a nice handwriting. He stopped answering my calls because sometimes men hurt and don't know how to do it in public. I sent one message every day for 10 days saying just that I loved him. that I was here, that I would wait. On the 11th day, he replied, "Don't. You deserve a life that doesn't ask you to fight your father." It was a kindness shaped like a knife. I folded the phone into my palm and pressed until the edges left a mark. Grief shrinks the world and makes you inventory its contents. Mine had a mother who thought tears were private, a father who thought everything else was. It had a wardrobe with more dresses than days, a calendar dense with purposes that looked noble on websites and thin in kitchens where ovens had died. It had a sister who texted Bible verses and memes in equal measure and arrived with soup the size of a small pond. "I know you loved him," she said, blowing on a spoon. "I still do," I said. "That's not illegal," she replied. "It's just inconvenient." She sat on my bed and told me a story of a woman who married a man our father liked and learned new ways to be lonely. "Do not inherit his expectations," she said, tapping my forehead. "You can do hard things." I went back to the bakery 2 weeks after the fire because sometimes the body performs pilgrimage before the mind agrees. The shutters were up, the oven cold, the flour dust settled like old snow. Someone had propped the door open to air out the smell of smoke and loss. I stood in that quiet, in the shape his work had left behind, and felt a terrible clarity that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with use. Money couldn't make him love me. Money couldn't fix pride or grief. But money could buy time and space and ovens for people whose bread kept whole blocks fed. Influence could move city meetings from 3 p.m. behind closed doors to 7 p.m. in community halls with microphones that worked. And my mouth, which had always been polite, could learn to be loud. I resigned from 2 committees the next day with emails that were not poems, but weren't apologies either. I called the city planner again and didn't flirt with memory. I threatened headlines. I visited bakeries I had only ever posted from and asked owners about permits and prices and sleepless nights. I sat with women who ran church kitchens and men who baked out of garages and teenagers who sold warm fat cook from oil-stained paper, and I asked what they needed instead of telling them what I thought they should want. I started something with a name that would make my father roll his eyes. Small ovens, big hearts. And I begged for money in rooms that had heard me beg for smaller things. I used my surname on letters and my first name on WhatsApps, and I learned that no is sometimes a step on the way to fine. What do you want? I learned to bake. This was important for reasons that had nothing to do with pastry. I needed to know what it took to make something rise with my hands, and not just my signature. I learned that kneading looks like prayer when done by someone who believes in mornings. I burned 3 trays of rusks and cried only once. I made 300 samosas one weekend with a woman who scolded me and loved me at the same volume. I hurt in places my Pilates had never met. And when city council finally convened the meeting I'd been loud enough to win, I spoke like a person who had flour under her nails. "You cannot preach small business while pricing the heat out of the oven," I said into a microphone that did not squeal. "If you move a bakery, you move a neighborhood's mourning. Cap rent increases. Streamline food permits. Offer microgrants for equipment repairs when a wire in a wall makes a fire of a life." People clapped because sometimes clapping is the only way people can say they see you. I did not see my father in the audience, but I heard from him that night. He did not threaten. He requested dinner, which in our family was a white flag draped over a roast. He listened with his hands folded, while I explained leases and ovens and the economies of 5 a.m. He asked me if I loved the boy. I told him Saifo was a man, and yes. He asked if I wanted his help. I said yes and no in the same breath. Yes to the city, no to the strings. He stared at me as if I'd switched languages, and then, to my surprise, he laughed once, tired and soft. "Your mother warned me that raising daughters meant raising my ceiling," he said. "I don't like it, but I'll live." The next morning, the developer announced a pilot, rent caps and community rate spaces with a lottery monitored by a union of traders who had no time for nonsense. It was not mercy. It was arithmetic forced to show its workings. What I could not force was Saifo. I saw him once by accident at the wholesalers, both of us debating butter brands like diplomats. He looked thinner the way loss thins men, at the edges, where you don't notice until you do. We stood in the aisle and sheened over the things we were not brave enough to say with jokes about ovens and permits. They capped the rent, I said, trying to make my voice casual. There are grants for equipment now. He nodded. I heard. People talk like the wind carries news. He put 2 slabs of butter in his cart and then took one out. I wanted to ask if he was opening again. I wanted to tell him that grief had taught me patience and movement at once. I wanted to say I'd learned to braid dough the way his mother had taught him. Instead, I picked up a sack of flour I didn't need and held it like a shield. You look tired, I said, which is not what I meant. You look brave, he replied, which is closer to what he meant. We parted at the till like strangers who shared a language once. Small ovens, big hearts grew because need is a good fertilizer. We fixed a woman's fryer in Athlone and kept 6 teenagers in school without saying the words, kept 6 teenagers in school. We replaced a mixer that had died of old age and a fridge that had died of a storm. We hired a bookkeeper who made spreadsheets look like promises kept. We launched a pop-up community kitchen in a church hall and learned that men who never listen will listen when chewing. And one morning I arrived at the hall with crates of tomatoes only to find a queue outside and the smell of cinnamon in the air and a man in a gray t-shirt standing behind borrowed tables with braids of bread cooling like sleeping cats. He looked up when the door opened. The way his mouth softened could have made a song. He didn't smile yet. He waited for me to come to him. I thought you were opening again, I said, because courage is sometimes a preheated oven. You still have to put something in it. He gestured at the loaves. Pilot batch. The church offered their hall till I can sign a lease. Your rent cap made that part less like drowning. He wiped his hands on his apron. There was a smear of flour on his jaw. I wanted to kiss it off with a hunger that didn't feel like grief anymore. I'm sorry I didn't call, he said. I was ashamed. Not of you. Of loving someone who came with a world that terrified me. Of needing help and not knowing how to accept it without feeling small. I stepped closer. I'm sorry I tried to fix you with money because I didn't know how to sit inside your storm. I'm sorry I made love feel like a campaign. We stood there, 2 apologies cooling between us like cake that would collapse if cut too soon. The second time we kissed, the city was loud and happy on the other side of the hall's thin walls, and somewhere someone burned onions and sang. It tasted like cinnamon and confession. We didn't promise the future. We promised breakfast. He asked me to come early to the hall to help with the first real bake. I set my alarm for a time that made me a better person. We folded dough and stacked trays and laughed with our shoulders. He showed me a lease for a space 3 streets from the old bakery. Cheaper because an accountant who'd eaten his bread for years owned the building and had a heart in his chest. Not sunrise loaves anymore, he said, tapping the blank line where a name would go. Feels like a new chapter needs a new cover. I wrote Rise and Shine Collective with my neatest pen and he nodded. Collective, he said, because this time it doesn't fall if we do. Opening day felt like a public holiday someone forgot to announce. The line curved past the barber and the tailor and the auntie who sold mango slices with chili that had made its own myth. Children pressed noses to glass. The ovens glowed like good news. My mother arrived with flowers and hugged Sifo like she had always known him, which was not an apology, but close. My father came late and stood at the back and bought 2 sourdoughs like a man practicing a language he never learned as a boy. Sifo handed him change and held his gaze and said thank you with dignity unbent. It was not a reconciliation, it was a transaction invested with hope. The first batch out of the oven were croissants with the kind of lamination that makes people forgive rent and weather and men. We cut one on the counter and watched steam write cursive in the air. He put the first half in my hand. For the girl who eats on the pavement, he said. And this time the joke carried a history that didn't hurt like it used to. We kept our love like we kept our bakery now. In the open, with locks we trusted and lights we could afford. I still went to meetings in rooms where men spoke soft cruelties into cups of coffee and learned to yawn without opening my mouth. I still wrote proposals and broke into laughter at midnight with women who made magic from donated onions. He still woke at 4 and cursed at ovens that acted like toddlers. He still delivered to aunties who waited in slippers. We didn't fix everything, we started what we could. When the city faltered, and it did, because cities are just collections of human beings who sometimes forget their own power, we held pop-ups and fundraisers and reminded anyone who would listen that bread is politics and prayer and proof. When we argued, we did it without closing doors. When we loved, we did it like people who had burned and risen and learned heat is not the enemy if you learn how to hold it. Once, months after opening, the power cut in the middle of a dawn bake because the grid had decided it needed a nap. We stood in the dark with a tray of croissants halfway risen and 10 minutes to invent a miracle. This is where rich girl saves the day with a generator she keeps in her handbag, he joked into the soft dark. I shook my head and handed him my phone with the flashlight on. The aunties arrived with camping gas like soldiers. The barber brought an inverter he swore he'd paid for legally. The tailor stitched a curtain over the door to keep the heat in. We baked those croissants half on a gas flame, half with community physics, and when we pulled them out, the room clapped. Look at us, he whispered, forehead to mine. Look at what love and neighbors can raise. I looked, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a girl trying to outrun her shadow. I felt like a woman standing in her own light. There are mornings when he still wakes from dreams where the oven coughs and dies. There are afternoons when I still flinch at my phone vibrating with my father's name. But fear and love can share a room if you let them rehearse their lines. On a soft Sunday, we closed early and took bread to the cliffs above the tide pools, where the city looks like a secret you can keep and the mountain wears her quiet without effort. We ate slowly, butter knives singing against enamel plates, and he said, when I was young, I thought rich girls wore their happiness like jackets. Now I know sometimes it's armor. I said, when I was young, I thought poor men's pride was just stubbornness. Now I know it's architecture. He took my hand. We built something, he said. I watched ships move like punctuation across the horizon and nodded. Not just the bakery. When people ask me what changed my life, I don't say love, though that is true. I say mornings, waking before the city's judgments, learning the names of men who clean streets and women who bake for funerals, learning that flour looks like snow and forgiveness and the dust that settles after a fire, learning that money can be either water or ice and you choose which one you hold it, learning that fathers can surprise you and that you can surprise them, learning that a community can rise like dough if you give it salt and time and something warm to lean against. Learning that the girl who once ate bread on a pavement because it was still breathing can become the woman who keeps it breathing for others. On the 1-year anniversary of Rise and Shine Collective, we gave away 100 loaves, no questions asked. We took a photograph in front of the window, not formal, just a tangle of arms and aprons. You can see in the picture that we are tired in the good way. You can see that the ovens have behaved and the counters have stories. You can see my mother in the corner pinning a notice for a choir concert and my father outside, pretending to study his receipt, because men like him need scripts for showing up. And in the middle, you can see me and Saifo, foreheads almost toughing, laughing at something that didn't need words. The camera caught the moment a child in the queue shouted, "They're the people who make mornings." People turned and clapped, and I felt heat rise in my face, the kind of heat that once meant shame, and now just meant life moving through me. He squeezed my waist. "We are," he whispered, "and we will keep being." Sometimes when the city is loud with sirens and opinions, I think about that first morning. Cinnamon in the air, a hand-painted sign, a man whose hands knew how to make something rise without a sermon. I think about a girl who thought she could keep her worlds separate if she walked quickly and ate her bread before anyone saw. I think about an oven that died and an old hall that became a temple because the community decided it could be. I think about how love broke us open and then used the cracks as windows. And I think about this. The most romantic thing I have learned is not that someone can kiss you at dawn and make your heart hurry. It's that they can stand beside you at noon when the oven coughs and the city forgets your name and heat wants to be a fire again. And together, you remember how to bake.